Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're at my bench again and we're working on this old Swiss trench watch. This watch probably hasn't been serviced in 50 or 60 years. It's barely wanting to run. I'm guessing that for the most part the spring is probably really worn down or just got a lot of dried grease on it. It wants to go. I mean, if I kick start it a little bit, it'll start to beat a little bit, but yeah, no, it needs a good service. So we're going to show you today how to take this down and get it all serviced and cleaned up. I can't find a replacement mainspring for this, so what we're going to do is we're going to refurb the mainspring that's in there, and that's not that very difficult to do. You can clean them up real good, use some 8000 grit sandpaper on them, just get all that old grease off the mainsprings, clean them again, and grease them up with some mainspring oil, and they will be fine. Here you can see we're tearing down the watch a little bit. To get it out of the case, I have to release the clutch from the stem and pull out that stem, put it aside. The front bezel's a little bit locked in here. There's no real simple way to get this front bezel off, so I'm going to use a dull razor blade here to get that open. And there's a lot of you haters out there who are going to bitch me out for that, but hey, this is how we do it. Gently pry off the hands. We get those hands aside. We'll kind of clean them up, remove any old dirt on them. For the most part, the watch is in decent shape. The case shows its age. It's almost 100 years old now. So we're going to take this to the polishing machine and buff out all that chrome plate. Next step is to remove the dial, and here you can see we've got some half screws here where you just loosen those up, get them in the right position so the dial will pop out. There should be two of those, yes, right there, hidden in this. There is no name on this movement, so very difficult to find out who made this or when it was made. Like I said, these trench watches came out between the 20s and 40s. They were mass produced. I don't know, with no name being on the movement, common for the older Swiss watches prior to or post pre-World War II. After World War II, all the American watch equipment went over to Europe to rebuild. This cannon pinion is pretty much frozen on the center wheel. I'm going to try to get it off, but I did not have any good luck getting this thing off. So I'm going to actually leave it in place. Gently pull out the escapement wheel, a little bridge for the escapement wheel, and we'll put that aside. Again, when you find these watches, you'll discover that they were mass produced. They were very low quality. These are not very valuable watches. They are gaining in value a little bit because there's so few of them left. Down here in Florida, any place there's a lot of pawn shops, a lot of people bring these in expecting to get a lot of money. They get, $3-4 for them, and most of these get trashed. There's not much of a collector's market for these. I imagine 10-20 years from now, because there will be even fewer of them, that these will have some value to them. This is a 3/4 bridge, so we're going to pull out the 4 screws that hold this bridge in place. Of course, there are no jewels on this bridge. Pretty much there's no jewels in this watch at all. And once we get those 4 screws loosened up, we can go ahead and remove that bridge. Watches like these are perfect for you guys who want to learn how to do this at home, because this watch comes apart relatively easy. There are a few parts to this watch. There are no jewels, so you really can't destroy a jewel. You might be able to break a pinion if you're pretty abusive to it. But this is a good practice piece when you're learning how to do watch repair, or if you want to fix your own watch. This is a good way to start. You can see this bridge is giving me a little bit of a difficult time coming apart. And when we finally get that bridge off, we can see that it looks like the mainspring barrel's in fairly rough shape. Apologize for the focusing. Again, I'm still getting used to my new camera. I haven't had a chance to do a lot of filming, so I'm going to do a lot of practicing with the camera over the next week or two. I'll grab that mainspring barrel out and put that aside. We'll grab the clutch gear and we'll put that aside. And those are the two screws for the dials, so we're going to leave those in place. I'm not going to completely disassemble every single part on this watch, but anything that really needs to be cleaned, what I will do is tear it down and clean every part individually. That main wheel with the cannon pinions stuck to it, I'm not going to take a chance of breaking this watch. It's not worth it. So I'll do a full service clean on the main bridge, the main plate here with that gear attached. And we'll pull out the setting and winding system. This little bridge articulates and it allows you to set and wind the watch depending on what position it's in. On this particular model Swiss watch, there's a little button on the side. I'm sure you saw that in the beginning. If you push that button in, it changes it from winding to setting. And all three of these little gears with that little bridge articulate together. So we're looking at the top side of the main plate, and this is the underside of the main plate. And I'm just examining it for wear, rust, any damage, anything that's in there pretty bad. That's going to have to be degreased and cleaned, so we'll put that in the degreasing solution, and I'll head over to the mainspring barrel. This ratchet wheel has to come off. This ratchet gear allows the mainspring to wind inside the barrel. And you can see all the dried oil on this watch, particularly why this watch wouldn't run. There's so much grease and oil that's been dried up over the years that it just doesn't move very well. So we're going to tear this apart and gently take the barrel out. Once we get that barrel out, then I can clean everything. Here you can see the inside of the cover as well as the mainspring pinion. And we'll just put that aside. These will go in the degreasing solution while I pull the spring out very, very carefully. Always take note at which way the mainspring winds because you're going to want to put it in the same way. And here you can see I'm just unwinding it with my fingers. I'm going to take a look at this. It's really, really dried up and dirty inside. Years of that spring rubbing against itself, little bits of metal kind of making it less springy and kind of wearing down in position. So what we'll do is temper this, clean it, smooth it out, file it real good, and then I'll grease it and put it back in the barrel. So off to the cleaning machine. We'll just do all these parts individually. Usually it takes me about 45-50 minutes to do each of these parts, or all of the parts together. Now I spent a good 20 minutes cleaning up this mainspring. It's really very smooth now, and what I want to do is just get some mainspring grease on my gloves here and then just rub that against the mainspring. So I'll go all the way across the whole surface of the mainspring. Now I'm doing this by hand. I do not recommend that you wind a mainspring back in the barrel by hand. In this case, I'm doing it by hand because my mainspring winder was not a good fit for this spring to seat into the barrel, and I didn't have any chucks for that. So what I decided to do was so that I can feel the temper of the spring as I'm putting it in. I'm going to be very, very careful to do this slowly and as not to bend the spring. The biggest problem with winding a mainspring in by hand is that if you push too hard with your fingers, you could actually damage the spring. So you have to use caution. And what you see in my right hand is I grab the top part of the barrel and I'll twist it down clockwise, letting the barrel slip in my left hand fingers and just slide the spring into position. This way I'm not putting any real pressure on the mainspring, and I'm just letting it seat itself into the barrel by that light amount of pressure. And if you do this very carefully, you can do it well, but it's not something I would ever recommend. And of course, if you can get yourself a new mainspring, that's the best way to do it because the new mainspring will give this watch a whole lot more life. And if you can't find one that fits, this is the optimal way to go to restore a watch, especially in this vintage. Now, without knowing the manufacturer or the strength of this spring, although I have tools that'll measure it, it's really going to be a hard find, and I'm not going to find a new spring to fit this well, so the watch wouldn't run well with a new spring of different temper. Again, I'm grabbing the barrel with my right fingers and twisting it clockwise, and the left fingers are just basically acting as a guide to allow the mainspring to seat inside the barrel. So I'm not putting any pressure, none whatsoever, on the mainspring so as not to kink it or bend it, which would destroy the functionality of the watch. That process takes a while. It's a good long mainspring. So once we get that in there, we'll put the barrel pinion in, and this is what actually powers the watch. This little is a little notch, a little tooth on there that grabs the center of the spring, allows you to wind it with the ratchet. Puts pressure on the barrel. The barrel is actually the watch's motor. Once that's seated, and now we know it's greased and in properly, I'll put the cover back on. We'll put this aside. And just in case, another good tool to keep around is a good pair of parallel pliers, nylon tipped. This way you can close up your barrel covers onto the mainspring barrels without doing any damage to the mainspring barrel. Once that's clamped, you can move on to assembly. So I'll put the mainspring barrel in the parts tray and move on to the next step. I'm just making sure I've got all the parts going where they need to go. That little brass piece was the pin that allows me to set or wind the watch. When you push it in, it's in the setting mode. If you leave it out, it'll wind the watch. So we'll start by assembling the watch in the reverse order that we took it apart. It's always a good idea. If you do not remember how a watch comes apart, I would start by taking pictures of a watch every step of your disassembly. And then you can go back and take a look at the way that everything was assembled as or before you disassembled it, so you know where everything goes back. Over time, you'll just get used to knowing which gear goes where, and even watches I've never seen before, when I take them apart, it's pretty obvious how they all go back together. I imagine it's probably like a car mechanic taking an engine apart in a car. You kind of know what every part's for. Okay, so now it's time to put the ratchet wheel back onto the mainspring barrel, and that ratchet goes in one way. It is keyed, so there's a square notch, and that notch lines up, and it's pressure fit. Once it's pressure fit to that little pinion there, when we stick it back on the watch, it'll stay in place. Again, I apologize for the focus. With that ratchet on the mainspring barrel, let's get that position inside the watch. And now that that's done, we can go ahead and put our 3/4 bridge in place. It's a matter of lining it up and just checking where this thing goes. A little shaky today here. And no, I don't have Parkinson's disease, just like all you haters out there like to point out that anybody who shakes when they do work must be sick. This tends to happen more when I'm filming, because I'm trying to get it done right for you guys. You're going to line up all your gears and your pinions, and then you're going to gently push down. I tend to use either an old oiler without a tip on it, or I use some very fine, pointy tweezers to get those gears in position and line them up so that I don't do any damage. And as you line them up, you can actually just gently turn each gear, and if the train starts moving all the way around, you know you're in good shape. So again, you put very little pressure on these plates, and then you're going to adjust the position of each gear so that it fits within its pinion. If you have jeweled bridges, I would be even more delicate, because you can crack a jewel very easily. Again, here we've got all steel parts, and there are no jewels in this watch. So once we get everything seated correctly, the gears turn well, we can go ahead and start putting in the screws for the bridge. Remember, this 3/4 bridge, unlike American watches, has 4 screws. American watches typically have 3 on a 3/4 bridge, sometimes 2. Again, you're going to want to reassemble this the opposite way that you took it apart. Again, I've mentioned this in other videos. When you're assembling a watch, I usually put the screws in just tight enough that they hold everything together, but still loose where the gears can be moved in case without any damage. This way, I'm not putting any pressure on any gear, any pinion point, any pivot that could necessarily break if I put too much pressure on it. So you're going to be very gentle when reassembling these until you make sure that all the pinions and pivots are seated correctly. And just in case you're wondering, the pinion is the little nub of a staff on a gear, and the pivot point is the little hole in the bridge. Once everything is seated correctly, I'll test again just to make sure the gears are turning correctly. We'll go in and just make sure any adjustments we have to make. I've got one gear in there. The third gear is kind of giving me a hard time. Sometimes I like to go under the microscope to do that. Once you get the gears all situated, then we can go back and tighten up all the screws. I'm just going to check everything and make sure that there's power on this, and there is. The mainspring's got a little tension to it, which is even good. And now we'll just go ahead and start assembling the watch. With that full 3/4 bridge plate in place, I can now put the ratchet gear in and then insert the stem. Now I put the stem in now and seat it so that I can do testing on the watch as I move forward from this point. So with the stem in place, I'll tighten up that clutch, and it'll hold the stem on the watch. And go ahead and test the winding. This should make sure that the spring is winding and the gears should turn. A little off camera here, but you can see it. Here we go with the setting and winding gears. There are 3 of these. 2 on this particular watch are the exact same. The center wheel is larger. So the gear to the left and the gear to the right are exactly the same on either side. On American watches, they are never the same. And on most modern watches today, if you have an articulated winding system like this, they would not be the same either. So here you can see I'm seating it. That little spring there that I'm holding with the tweezers, that's the spring that releases the winding system and puts it back in winding mode when you release the pin on the side of the case. And we are going to gently seat the screw. There's only one screw that holds this little bridge in place and these 3 gears together. It's always a good idea to make sure everything's locked up and seated correctly. If you have to make any adjustments, now is the time to do it. Don't tighten that screw down until everything is seated correctly. Now on these old Swiss watches, you're going to find that most of the winding gears, they kind of wear down. They're not made of good quality metal. They weren't made to last more than 30 years. These were disposable watches that were brought into the United States market, again, pre-World War II. Now here you can see I'm just testing the winding and setting articulation. That spring kind of kicks that back and forth so you can see how that little clutch system works. Now I'm going to go ahead and just give this a little bit of oil here and there just to make sure it's oiled. At some point in time, I'm going to put the setting gears back in place, the hour gear on this, and I'll put the dial back on. So I'm not going to have access to the upper part of the main plate. Now these are not jeweled again, so oil is very important. You're going to make sure you got a good quality oil in these. If these pivot points are kind of worn down, you can polish them a little bit, but it's not going to give you much of a useful functionality out of these. Okay, so we're getting close to being done with the assembly of the watch movement itself. This is the escape wheel and the bridge for it. Now this type of escapement wheel can be a little bit tricky. Again, I apologize for the focus problem here. But these little gears, again, with the low quality manufacturing of these watches, they are great for practice, but as far as accuracy and timekeeping, they were never that accurate. You're just going to be careful when assembling them. Once that's all assembled, again, I can go ahead and test the movement of the watch. Tighten up all the screws. Make sure that everything's running good, and if that gear is moving smoothly, then we know we're seated correctly, and I'll just go ahead and tighten it up one last time. And you can see I'm doing this little by little, just making sure that everything's done before I tighten it up so that I don't have any chance of breaking any parts. Okay, so this watch, I apologize, does have one jewel. It has an upper balance jewel. And I'm going to get that lined up there. So this would be a 2 jewel movement. There's a whole jewel and a cap jewel in there. I ended up taking them apart, cleaning them, putting this all back together. This part of the escapement is a little bit on the hairy side when you're getting it in there. Once you get that balance in position with the balance cock on, you can go ahead and gently, slowly tighten up that balance screw or that balance cock screw. Again, you're not going to tighten it all the way because you're going to be doing a little bit of testing as you go forward. So you want to make sure that balance moves freely. Adjust the screw tightness as you go, and once you're happy with everything, you can give it a test. I'm going to give this a little bit of a wind and we'll see how it runs. Looks like it's doing pretty good. Again, this is not a high quality watch movement, but it's still useful. There are no small adjustments to make for timing on this particular watch, so getting it to run within 10 seconds a day is a trick by itself. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that everything's oiled, run, and done right here. We're going to put the setting gear on. This setting gear works with the winding and setting system. Get that gear in place. And now we'll put the hour wheel on. Put a dial washer on this. You didn't see that, but I did put a dial washer on this. And now we're going to seat the dial on the watch, flip it over, and gently holding it in my fingers, I'll go ahead and adjust those screws that hold the dial in position. Very similar to how some of the other watches get tightened up. And now that the dial feet are secure, there's the face of the watch, and it is running, and it's running pretty well. I'm going to throw this on the timer just to double check. Now what I like to do is start with the position of the timing pointer right in the middle, and that tells me if I have any adjustments I have to make left or right, or if the beat is out of error. If the beat's in error, then you're going to have to make some serious adjustments to the position of the hairspring on this watch. Luckily, it's not that off that I couldn't get it timed. Once it's timed, again, I'll go ahead and throw it back in the case. I'll throw on the hour hand, and then we're going to push that little pin in. It's kind of hard to see with the gloves on, but I'm going to push that little pin just below the crown. And if I turn the crown, you can see it sets the time. And I'm just going to put that towards 3 o'clock and get that situated. And now we'll put the hour hand on. push that down with the bridge part of my tweezers, and then we'll go ahead and give that a quick adjustment. Make sure the hands aren't rubbing against each other. Looks pretty good so far. Now what I like to do is I mark the inside of the case and I mark it with everything I do. And it's kind of hard to use a scribe to do that sometimes, because sometimes I do a lot of work to a watch. So I bought myself a laser engraver, and I do a lot of stuff with it. This thing is phenomenal. So if you guys are interested in seeing what else you can do with the laser engraver, you can see here I'm just marking the inside of the case with the initials, the month and year that I worked on the watch, and all the codes that I used to mark what I did to the watch. The next guy who opens that up will be able to figure it out. Now here's the watch, completely polished and cleaned, and it's running pretty well. I managed to get this running about 8 seconds off per day. It's running a little bit on the slow side. If I try to speed it up, it just kind of goes way out of whack. So I'm going to leave it there. I think 8 seconds a day for a 100-year-old watch with only 2 joules in it is not bad. Again, these are great watches, guys, to practice on. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. Any comments that you have, leave them in the comment section below, good, bad, or indifferent. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.